Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. Starting off the show with a recent excellent comment from Apple Ratings and Reviews because it's relevant to today's pod. Nathan the Conservative writes, I'm a conservative. Yep, I gathered that from the handle, Nathan. I appreciate David and the way he forms questions and thoughts without the roses and rainbows we've become accustomed to. I find the show to be politically balanced and offers great insight from all sides of the aisle. Keep up the great work. Well, Nathan, thank you for that. We're going to put your observation to the test because we have an Ontario PC Cabinet Minister on the pod today. We're very, very lucky to have Todd Smith, the Minister of Energy, as our guest. Minister, Nathan has sounded the warning. This is no rose rainbow kind of show. Please prepare yourselves, sir. Minister Smith is a graduate of Loyalist College. He had a 16-year career in radio news, rising to the position of news director at Quinte Broadcasting. In 2011, he ran as the progressive conservative candidate in Prince Edward Hastings and knocked off a well-tenured Liberal cabinet minister. He was elected to the new riding of Bay of Quinte in 2018 as part of Premier Ford's Conservative majority. In the last 5 years, Minister Smith has headed up 3 different portfolios as well as serving as Ontario Government House Leader. But he was appointed Minister of Energy in June 2021 and been very active in that job for over 2 years now. So today, besides learning a little bit more about his backstory, we're going to dive into the electrification of Ontario. How are we going to do it? How are we going to generate the power? How are we going to get it to everybody's house? And why are we riding with electricity? Minister Smith, it's such a pleasure to have you on the Herle Burly. I really appreciate you making the time for us.
Hi, David. It's great to join you. I've been listening for probably, 18 months or so. I think I picked you up a while back when I was out on a hike with my dog and have been listening ever since. So it's great to be on the show with you.
Oh, my God. Dogs are the best.
They are. They're way better than cats. Now I'm going real controversial right off the bat. On
this show, dogs are better than cats is not a controversial thing to say. Not one tiny bit. Where do we find you today?
I am in my Bay of Quinte Riding Association office, which is in Rossmore, Prince Edward County, deep in the heart of Scott Reed country. And what's interesting is this is a beautiful place to be right across the bridge from Belleville. And I've been in politics for 12 years. And I've lived in the Quinte region for 31 years, and I've never met Scott Reed.
Well, I don't imagine he's welcome there, is he?
That may be true, actually.
Like me from Regina, some of us liberals, we had to flee our homes.
I think he comes back from time to time, but
I think he does, but I think he ducks pretty quickly into his mother's basement. So let's start with this. You gave up a lifetime job in radio journalism to run for office in 2011. Why did you do that?
I had done the broadcasting thing for 16, 18 years. I was actually looking for a change at the time. Had considered teaching broadcasting at Loyalist College. And as you may know, Loyalist College at one time had one of the most recognized broadcasting programs in the country next to Ryerson University. So a lot of really well-known broadcasters have come out of Loyalist College. I was looking for a bit of a change. I was approached by Tim Hudak and the PC party. I had no real interest in getting involved in politics. I was at a time when broadcasters were fair and unbalanced. Right. Or fair and balanced, I should say. Now maybe they may be a little bit more unbalanced, but I was approached by the party to run in 2011, and after serious consideration with my wife Tanya, who's an educator here from the area, we thought we would give it a shot. I knew Tim a little bit because I had interviewed him over the years as a cabinet minister in the Harris government, and then, of course, winning the party leadership in 2009 and having interviewed him a few times there. I followed politics, obviously, as the news director and had a pretty good idea, or at least I thought I had a pretty good idea about what politics was all about and how it worked. And
you had no idea, right? You had no idea.
No, that's where I was going. I had no idea. You think you know until you know. right? No,
my friend Ellie Elboim, who covered politics for many years before getting involved in it, says the biggest mistake he made when he was in journalism was assuming that everything he saw coming out of governments was strategy, when so much of it is just fucking haphazard, right?
There may be a certain truism to that. Anyway, no, I made the decision to plunge into it in 2011. Hudak at that time had appointed, which was a little bit unusual at that time, candidates that he wanted to run in certain areas. It seems to happen a lot more nowadays, where the leader chooses, and there's instead of going the letting the riding choose who the representative is. I think there were 11 of us that were chosen by Hudak in that election. I think the only 2 of those candidates that made it through to being elected were myself and Minister Fedeli, who I've been serving with for 12 years now. Right. So yeah, that's how I got into the game, so to speak. And I was always really, really involved in the local community. This is a tight-knit community. Not only was I the news director at the radio stations, I was also the voice of the Belleville Bulls of the Ontario Hockey League, along with my colleague Jack Miller. I was at every charitable function going in town as the MC, trying to raise money for the hospital foundation or whatever it was. So, I had a pretty high profile in the community, and I think that was appealing to Tim and the PC party at the time, as somebody who could potentially knock off well-tenured Liberal cabinet minister Leona Dombrowski, who was the education minister at the time in 2011.
Right. Was Tim Hudak the first person who'd asked you to run? Because you're an obvious candidate. For the reasons you described. Was he the first person to ask you to run?
No, it was the party apparatus. It was...
No, but sorry, that election, the PCs were the first people who'd ever come to you and said you should be a candidate.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, absolutely.
Really?
They were the first. Yeah.
Okay. And what made you decide you were a PC?
Well, I always was a PC. I just tried to be fair and balanced. I grew up in a very conservative home in New Brunswick. My mom and dad still live in Riverview, New Brunswick. Good Baptist family, and so I always had those leanings. And I think, when I was hosting the phone-in radio show at Quinte Broadcasting, or guest hosting or appearing, and you did have an opportunity outside of the traditional newscast to share your opinion on something, I think local conservatives felt like they had a friend in me. Right. On the radio. It was pretty obvious, even though I tried to be as balanced as possible in my reporting. So I think that's how it happened. We had a mayor in Belleville at the time who ended up being our MP, who was approached by the Conservatives to run. And from what I understand, he also suggested that they approach me, because he ended up being a Liberal MP at the end of the day. And now he's our mayor again, Neil Ellis, for those who are familiar with Neil.
Right. How long did you live in New Brunswick?
Well, I grew up there until I was 21, went to Riverview High School, and worked a little bit in a long-term care facility as what you would now call a personal support worker, a PSW. I was an orderly back in the day. I did go to university for a short time. I wanted to be a high school teacher. I was one of the jocks at school, played on the hockey team and the baseball team, and a little bit of football, and wanted to be a high school phys ed teacher. At the time in the late 80s.
Just so you could wear sweats all day long.
Yeah, exactly, in the short Adidas shorts, which were very much in style, with the athletic socks pulled up to my knees.
Totally.
Yeah, but at that time in the late 80s and early 90s, there were no teaching jobs. So everybody was graduating ahead of me at UNB from the program, and very few of them were actually moving on to becoming teachers. They were going to work at the Chrysler warehouse or at their buddy's fishing boat and pulling lobster out. Which was a pretty good way to make money at that time too, but not something that I was interested in. And so a colleague of mine who I played junior hockey with, as a matter of fact, on the East Coast, was a graduate of Loyalist College. He said, Smitty, he said, you've got a face for TV and a voice for radio. I think outside my mother, he's the only other person that said I had a face for TV. But but he said, you should go up and take the program at Loyalist, and you'd do great at it. And so I did, and quickly got a job at Quinte Broadcasting about 3 months into the program. So it all worked out.
So it's the age-old story. You left the Atlantic provinces for opportunity in Ontario.
Yeah, really, it is true. And, back in the day, that was the case. A lot of people did that. I can recall in my broadcast journalism and broadcast programs, 50% of the student population were from the Maritimes. Now, Loyalists did a lot of recruiting in the Maritimes at that time as well. But yeah, there were a lot of familiar Maritime accents in the classrooms at Loyalist College at that time.
Right. Cool. All right, Minister, I'm so lucky to have your time, and I want to use it talking to you about the major effort that you're involved in now in terms of transitioning Ontario's energy system into an electricity system, and doing that in a way that meets climate change emissions reduction targets in a timely fashion. Maybe I could just, it's such a massive undertaking, and I've had people on the show, whether it be the federal minister or other climate experts, energy experts, to talk about the policy around this and to talk about some of the big structural plays. But you're the person that's making it happen on the ground here in Ontario. And so I know that this summer you released a plan to deal with this, that laid out the government's intentions with regard to decarbonizing the grid and doubling the supply of electricity in Ontario. Can you tell us about that plan?
Yeah, sure. A lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of consultation went into that plan. It's called Powering Ontario's Growth. We released it on July the 10th in Windsor with the Gordie Howe Bridge in the background and a large hydro and transformer station there. As I mentioned, we put a lot of effort into it, working with our system operator as well, the IESO, to determine what the needs were. And as a matter of fact, Powering Ontario's Growth was in response to a report that I had asked the ISO to do, the Pathways to Decarbonization report. There were a number of no-regret actions that were outlined. These were things that the ISO recommended that we go ahead and get work started on, so that, when it was time to pull a lever and build a new nuclear plant, we would be prepared to do that. So a couple of the big components of the plan were to start the pre-development work for Bruce C, so a third reactor at the Bruce nuclear facility on Lake Huron. For those who don't know, Bruce is the largest operating nuclear plant in the world. They provide about 6,700 megawatts every day that's there, reliable for our grid, a low-cost source of carbon-free electricity. So it seemed like a bit of a no-brainer to add potentially another 4,800 megawatts of nuclear power there. Because a lot of this pre-development type work had been done previously at Darlington, we had the ability there to be what we like to promote as the G7s, or the Western world's first small modular reactor that's being built there. So it's a 300 megawatt boiling water reactor. The technology is GE Hitachi, and construction has started at Darlington because all of that pre-development work had been done. The impact assessments, the environmental assessments, the CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission approval of the site was completed. So that's allowed Ontario to have the pole position on developing this new small modular reactor technology, which we're really excited about. And when I became the Minister of Energy back in the summer of 21, I had no idea really how important that project was going to be, or how international this role as the Minister of Energy in Ontario was going to be, because of the interest around the world in this project at Darlington. So, we had committed earlier under the leadership of Premier Ford and Greg Rickford to start that project. In December of 22, we announced that we were moving ahead and started construction, and that is going to be online by 2028, providing 300 megawatts of emissions-free electricity to our grid. Since then, in in the Powering Ontario's growth plan, we've announced we're going to add an additional 3 SMRs on that site for a total of 1,200 megawatts. That's enough electricity to power an additional 1.2 million homes in our province. And it just made sense to commit to this, and that's what we're doing. And so on top of those big nuclear projects, there's a lot of big transmission projects. There's a call for long duration storage as well to make the use of the renewables that we do have in the province already, make them more efficient, make the grid more efficient by allowing us to store the power instead of dumping it off for a loss or giving it away to neighboring jurisdictions, as was the practice. So we've got the largest competitive procurement for the largest procurement of energy storage facilities that's already awarded a number of contracts when it comes to battery storage facilities across the province. 3 of the largest facilities in North America are online to be built here in Ontario. So there's a lot in that plan, but those are sort of some of the highlights, I guess, to kick things off.
Okay. All right. So where were we? Yes. I wound up last week's message from our presenting sponsor, TELUS, by promising you some data on what happened in other countries when they went all in on a government policy that lets wholesalers resell access to an established carrier's network. I want to make something clear off the top. Wholesaling arrangements made cooperatively between carriers has existed for many years. What we're talking about here is requiring wholesale access at an artificially low mandated rate set by the government. That's called a mandated regime for those taking notes. Herle Burly-ites, I'm not one to quibble when data strongly suggests there's nothing to quibble about. So here are the facts. In Europe, several governments doubled down on mandated regimes, mainly for wireline services, to drive price competition at the cost of everything else. Cost them? It did, because it disincentivized carriers investing in their networks. In 2021, total telecom capital expenditures, or investments per person, dropped precipitously, 66% lower than the same measure in Canada. Quality took a nosedive. Average download speeds decayed, 20% lower in the EU than in Canada. Because think about it. If you were TELUS, or any carrier, why would you continue to invest in your infrastructure? Why would you keep innovating when other companies can just come in, ride your lines, and take advantage of everything that you've built at an artificially low mandated price you're forced to accept? In Europe, regulators are now looking for solutions to fill that huge investment gap. Price is one thing, investment and continued improvement is another, and it's critical to get the balance right. Particularly so, given what needs to still be done to connect remaining rural communities and drive innovation in wireless by implementing 5G across Canada. More on this in the weeks to come. Much more. I just want to quickly pick up on the nuclear aspect of it because you described building a new reactor at Bruce as a no-brainer. And yet, for decades, it was the furthest thing from a no-brainer. For decades, it seemed inconceivable that we would build another nuclear plant of that scale in Ontario. What's changed?
Well, interestingly enough, demand is growing in our province. And a little stat for you, I believe yesterday, which would have been Wednesday, September the 6th, was the highest demand that our province has experienced in over 10 years. So demand is growing. We've seen a lot of investment coming back to the province.
A lot of air conditioners running yesterday, right?
Well, yeah, it was a hot day for sure. There's no question about it. And what we've seen previously this week is that on a lot of those hot days, and actually previously in July when we had a real hot spell, the wind just disappears. It's not there. So you need baseload power. You need power that you can count on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that's not wind until we get storage facilities built. And even then, it's still not entirely reliable because the storage is only going to be able to dispatch at 4-hour increments or potentially 9-hour increments in long duration storage. So we need the power. We've seen those jobs coming back to Ontario. We've seen the big investments at places like LG Stellantis down in Windsor, the big Umicore plant close to me here in the Napanee area at Loyalist Township. There's also the Volkswagen plant that's coming to St. Thomas. All of those are big electricity users that are going to demand a lot of megawatts. And then we've also seen the investments by the provincial and federal governments into green steel making and electric arc furnaces at Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie. Just those 5 projects alone, those 3 EV battery plants and those 2 green steel making facilities are going to increase the industrial load in Ontario by 21%. Just those 5 projects. So, after really 18 years of pretty flat demand in the province, we know we're going to see a spike in demand, and it will come from those types of investments, but it's also going to come from the EVs that will become more obvious to everybody on our roads. There's about 120,000 electric vehicles on the road in Ontario right now, but those numbers are only going to grow significantly as we start to build those cars here and people start to move to EVs. And then just electrification in general in our manufacturing processes, and of course all the houses that we're going to need to build to meet the demand and meet the targets that we've set out, 1.5 million homes, and it's probably going to have to be more than that at the end of the day.
Right. Let's go back to the title of the plan, Powering Ontario's Growth. Do you see this energy transition that you are guiding as a drag on Ontario's economy or as a source of growth for Ontario's economy?
No, it's absolutely growth. I mean, and the reason that we want to see clean, non-emitting power generation in our province is because we believe that it actually is a driver of economic growth. I mentioned Minister Fedeli earlier. I have meetings with Minister Fedeli every month where he brings a stack of potential investors, plants that are looking to locate in Ontario that are part of the EV sector or EV battery sector or other manufacturers that are looking to come here. And one of the things that we're finding is that they want a clean grid. And we're very, very fortunate in Ontario that we have a grid that's a 90% non-emitting. It's one of the greenest grids in the world. When you look at Ontario and Quebec, we do have among the cleanest grids in North America for sure, the cleanest grids in North America for sure. So the more that we can ensure that we have that clean grid, it's very, very attractive to new investors in our province. And, I saw a report last week. I was with Minister Wilkinson and all of the energy ministers from across Canada in Quebec City for our annual Energy Ministers and Mining Conference, our federal, provincial, territorial meetings. And there was a report there where they were talking about nearly 50% of companies have ESG goals or ESG mandates, and those companies are looking to invest in jurisdictions that have clean grids. So we see it very, very much as an economic driver for our province. And quite honestly, I think we wouldn't be getting the investments in the EV sector if we didn't have a clean grid and we didn't have a commitment to ensure that that grid stays clean.
Okay. A number of provinces have expressed a discomfort with the federal government's timeline and regulations around this. How do you feel about them?
Well, we have concerns. There's no question about it. And I shared those concerns last week with Minister Wilkinson at the federal, provincial, territorial meetings. And those concerns come from our system operator, the ISO. One of the things I think that was a bit concerning is that Minister Guilbeault, when he put the draft plan in the window, hadn't consulted with the ISO at that time. We'd been talking with Minister Wilkinson, and we talk with Jonathan Wilkinson regularly about our grid and what we have planned and our Powering Ontario's Growth plan and how important it is for us to continue on this track. The ISO has told us that in order for this transition to be an orderly transition, then we have to make sure we're dealing with some concerns that they have first in order for the transition to go as smoothly as possible. When I first became the Minister of Energy back in the summer of 21, I asked the ISO to do a report because you'll recall maybe that there were 36 different municipalities across the province that had wanted to phase out natural gas immediately. And so we asked the ISO to do an off-gas report for us. And the report came back telling us we were to go off gas immediately. We would experience brownouts and blackouts, and we certainly would have experienced brownouts and blackouts on a day like yesterday where it was very hot and the renewables didn't show up. Like, that would have been a catastrophic situation if we didn't have our natural gas fleet.
Right.
And so there was not just the brownout and blackout concern, but there was the concern about what it would do to the cost of electricity too. And the ISO came back with a report saying it would drive up electricity bills by $100 a month for our customers across the province, which was not probably going to be the carrot that's needed.
Hey, if I can give you some political advice, be careful about rising hydro rates, eh?
Well, I may know a thing or two about that, David. I was the energy critic for a few years, back 2015 to 2018, and it was fairly top of mind for the people of Ontario, for sure. Well, you know what? I mean, and it's in people's bills. I mean, they get the bills every month. They can actually visualize it. They can see it, right? And I was one of those customers, even as the energy critic. I may have held up my own hydro bill in the house at one time or another, saying that my hydro bill has gone from $220 a month to $600 a month. And there were people being driven into energy poverty. So to your point, yes, it's very, very important that this transition is an orderly one. And that's why, we talk about reliability and avoiding brownouts and blackouts, which of course is going to discourage anybody from investing in your jurisdiction. But if you're also driving up the cost of electricity, that's going to have the same impact. And it's also going to discourage those who are maybe thinking about getting an electric vehicle to go that route. If electricity suddenly explodes in price, individuals aren't going to make that choice. And when you look at reducing emissions across the province, the electricity grid is only responsible for 3% of the electricity or the emissions in Ontario at this point in time. The emissions are really in the transportation sector or home heating sector. So if you discourage people from getting an open air heat pump, or if you discourage people from getting an electric vehicle, that's really where the fish are, and we want to fish where the fish are. At the same time, ensuring that when it comes to the clean electricity regulations, back to your question that you asked about, the concerns are really about end of life assets. For the natural gas plants, the proposed 20-year life of these facilities is far shorter than what we know they can deliver to the grid and is necessary to the grid. And there was some question around, how often we could use natural gas plants to meet peak demands, especially on hot summer days like we've been experiencing lately. And the ISO has just said they need more flexibility, especially on days like yesterday where we hit 23,000 megawatts of demand and, natural gas made up 6,000. Until we get the assets built that are in the Powering Ontario's growth plan, which we've committed to do, we need the feds to work with us. And Minister Wilkinson has said he's very open to hearing from us, and we're providing that feedback. There's been 75 days set aside for a comment period, and I hope they take the advice of our expert advisors, the operators of our system, and they're the ones that are operating this grid 365 days a year.
The gas component was certainly the most controversial part of your plan, and climate activists, if I could characterize them that way, are critical of the continued use of natural gas, and they seem to think there are alternatives. Are there literally no alternatives? I mean, natural gas is the best brand name in the world, right? Because everybody thinks it's clean, but it isn't that clean, right?
Well, there are alternatives, and we're building those. Really what we use our natural gas plants for most of the time is for peaking, meaning, that period between 2 o'clock.
Is that because you can just fire them up? Like a nuclear thing, you can't shut down. It's running. But you're saying a gas plant, you can say, okay, shit, we're going to need some electricity this afternoon. We can just fire this thing up.
Yeah, and that's happened. I've been at Portland's, for instance, in Toronto, the natural gas facility that's operated there. I've been there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the call has come in from the ISO saying, okay, guys, it's a hot day. We know we're going to need this number of megawatts. Can you get it ready to go and get it online for a couple of hours, really, when people are coming home, making their dinner, turning on their air conditioning units, firing up the TV, and settling in for a night at home. We often said back as opposition that the thing that was missing from the renewables was storage. And so the storage facilities that we've set out to build now, which have come down considerably in price, and we were actually pleasantly surprised by the results of the competitive procurement that we undertook with the ISO on acquiring a number of these battery storage facilities, is that they'll be able to dispatch energy for a period of 4 hours. The battery storage facilities will. So they will help, meet or do some of the work that the natural gas assets that we have in the province are now doing. And until we get those built, and I mean, we're building a large one, which is the Oneida project, in conjunction with the federal government and the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the Six Nations of the Grand River down in the London area in Haldimand County. There's two other really big ones that were just procured. Another one down in that area where we really need the power, and then another one in Eastern Ontario near Napanee. So there are a number of other projects around the province that are going to help the grid be more efficient and allow us as well to dispatch at times when we need. So to do the job of the natural gas facilities, and then long duration, which is a longer dispatchable period of time, which will help as well do the job of natural gas facilities, is coming. That's in our Powering Ontario's growth plan. We're looking at a couple of options. Those are pumped storage projects. One in Meaford, Ontario, at the Army base that's there.
Pumped storage is really cool. I don't know why we haven't done it before.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a facility already down at Niagara Falls, the Beck facility. It's a smaller pumped storage facility. The one at Meaford is 1,000 megawatts. So it's a big pumped storage facility and a great opportunity there, potentially. And then there's another one in Marmora, not far from where I am right now in Eastern Ontario. It's an old iron ore mine, which is a magnificent hole in the ground where they did a lot of mining back in the day. A lot of our 400 series highways are made out of the rock that came from that mine. And back in the early 90s, there was a proposal to pitch Toronto's garbage in that giant hole in the ground. And that didn't go over very well here in Eastern Ontario. So when the idea of a pump storage project came around, the community is fully on board and fully supportive of this. It would be a 400 megawatt project owned by Northland Power and OPG. So, it's these types of projects that we've submitted to the federal government for the ITCs, those investment tax credits as well, along with our nuclear projects that we're proposing, so that we can be partners with the federal government to help meet the targets that the federal government has set.
Right. So another summer has slipped away, the way summers do. Canadians are shaking the lake water out of their minds and getting back to work. This week, millions of students head back to school. Some of them, someday, will take their places in locomotive cockpits. They will become conductors or engineers, responsible for piloting a 200-ton iron behemoth, often pulling more than 100 rail cars from origin to destination safely and on time. It's kind of an awesome responsibility. Remember, we're talking about a machine with a stunning level of sheer inertia once it's moving. At cruising speed, it takes a mile or more to stop. And every day, locomotives make their way through Canadian cities. So you can probably imagine the care with which trained conductors are selected and trained. Our sponsor, CN, operates two campuses, one in Winnipeg, the other in Homewood, Illinois. All Canadian employees are trained in Winnipeg. Conductors learn to conduct minute inspections for hazards that, if left uncorrected, can lead to disaster. They learn to live by life-critical rules and the consequences for ignoring those rules. They go over the lessons learned by their predecessors, and they are taught to anticipate. They learn techniques for sure-footed walking on hazardous surfaces and something called slow brain focus when carrying out train inspections. They use model trains to understand the mechanics of switching cars in a rail yard. CN is even developing something called a slacker simulator, which replicates the surges and lapses of inertial force when powering up or slowing down a train. And all CN's new conductors, on graduation, take an oath and ring a bell as they leave campus, a final signification of total dedication to safety. Even at that, they will return to class every couple of years for retraining and recertification. They never stop going back to school, in other words. Like I said, it's a big job. How important are the federal tax credits in the most recent budget to your plan? I assume they are facilitating the nuclear build.
Yes, they are, and we're very thankful, by the way, to Minister Freeland, the finance minister and deputy prime minister.
That's the first time that's ever been said on this show.
No, I think Doug's relationship with Christia has been well documented.
Yes,
but it is really important to move forward together on these projects. And we were very appreciative of the investment tax credits. There's more to do on that front, and I've written to Minister Freeland and Minister Wilkinson about the tax credits. We believe that all constructors of these projects should be treated equally. Right now, Crown corporations only receive a 15% tax credit under the draft regulation of
okay.
So OPG would only get.
It was very novel that they were even eligible, though, right?
Yes, it's true. It's true, but they are going to play a very, very important role in making sure that we can hit the targets. So we just believe that OPG should be treated the same way as Bruce Power, and I know the folks in New Brunswick at MD Power feel the same way, and Sask Power, I believe, is also probably singing from the same song sheet on this as well. That our Crown Corp should probably have or not be penalized in this way. So we've got to build, we've got to get going, and these ITCs, the investment tax credits, are going to help considerably. We've submitted a list of potential projects. It's probably about 15 different projects in Ontario that will help us get to net zero, which is the target that's been set out for 2050 by the federal government. And so we appreciate the fact that they're open to negotiating with us on that.
Right. You were just at a FedProv meeting, mm-hmm. and I'm interested in your perspective. Many provinces are further behind Ontario in terms of cleaning their grid. Ontario got a head start with the coal plants a number of years ago. Other provinces that are, for instance, oil producing, face declines of significant industries as a consequence of this energy transition. What kind of stresses and strains is this project putting on the Federation?
It was a little bit calmer maybe than I thought it was going to be in Quebec City last week. I believe the concerns had been shared in large part prior to the federal provincial territorial meeting. I think there is a concern when it comes to the creep of the federal government into provincial jurisdiction. There's no question about that. I shared that as well last week with Minister Wilkinson in Quebec City. Certainly Alberta and Saskatchewan haven't been shrinking violets on that front. They've made the case very clear that energy, natural resources, in large part, are provincial jurisdiction. Having said that, though, I think there is a willingness to work together as much as possible. Certainly there is in Ontario. We have to work together. I think that's what Ontarians, I think it's what Canadians expect, really, is for us to work together to meet these goals. It's important. It's one of the most important issues that we're dealing with, for sure. We see it as a competitive economic advantage, as we outlined earlier, but obviously there's a much larger story to tell here when it comes to reducing emissions. And I think we're all committed to doing our part, but there has to be a realistic approach to doing that. And I think, without speaking for Saskatchewan and Alberta, which I would never do, we've shared our concerns in Ontario about an orderly transition and what that might look like for us here in Ontario. Certainly, I know Saskatchewan has made commitments to invest in our small modular reactor program, and they're signed members of our memorandum of understanding to deploy the same small modular reactor that we're building at Darlington at 4 different locations across Saskatchewan to phase out coal. So there are plans in the works. I think everybody realizes this is important. It's something that we're all committed to do, but as with every jurisdiction around the world, we all can't get there at the same time, given the circumstances that we've been handed. And, we're very fortunate, as you say, that coal was phased out here a number of years ago, and largely because of the commitment to our nuclear programs at Bruce Power, and also at Darlington, and then the continued operation of Pickering is very important for us as well, especially through to the fall of 2026, but then potentially a refurbishment of that facility to continue to provide the power to Ontario's grid.
I know I'm jumping around all over the place, but you're really saying some stimulating things. So, nuclear. The last question I should have asked you earlier, but it's about nuclear, which is, I should make it clear, by the way, I'm a big fan. I think you're making a very sound policy decision here. But there is a lingering question, which is, in this country generally, we seem to have a difficult time bringing in major capital expenditure projects on time and on budget. And if I'm wrong, go ride the Eglinton Crosstown. Nuclear projects are massive capital projects on steroids. They're enormous projects. And in the past, they have not come in on time and on budget. In the past, there have been some debacles around financing of nuclear plants in Ontario. What are you doing to make you confident that these nukes can be built in a timely fashion and in a way that doesn't burden the province with the kind of debt Darlington did, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think everybody learns from their mistakes, and the same can be said for those who work in the nuclear sector. They've really got this down to a science, no pun intended, on refurbishing these nuclear facilities. We just had Unit 3 at Darlington come back online in July, full refurbishment of that unit, 800 plus megawatts, 169 days ahead of schedule. That's massive, and on budget. And it's those types of performances and the lesson learned from other refurbishments that haven't gone that well. I have full confidence in the team at OPG. The same story can be told for the major component replacements, the MCRs as they call them at Bruce. Those refurbishments that are underway there, they're coming in on time, on budget. And so right now we have 4 of our CANDU reactors down for refurbishment. So that's why this summer was really, really important for us to get through this without any challenges, because this will be the only time that we'll have 4 down at the same time. But they're all coming in on time and ahead of schedule, and on budget. We feel that the same type of scrutiny and attention to detail is being applied to the small modular reactor program as well. In large part, it's the same partners as on the CANDUs. So you've got ACON, you've got SNCL Nuclear, you've got ES Fox, you've got BWXT, all of these companies that are in largely the Ontario supply chain, but Canada's supply chain, that have seen nuclear renaissances come and go in the past. And I think there's a real understanding now, especially here in Ontario and in Canada, that this is our time again to really lead the world when it comes to nuclear. I can tell you that, as I mentioned earlier, I've been traveling a bit. I didn't realize I was going to have this international bent to my position as the energy minister in Ontario. But last fall, I was in Europe and met with a number of different countries and companies. And it was sort of on the periphery of the emergency meeting of energy ministers in the European Union in Prague, in the Czech Republic. And met with the energy ministers who were in crisis at that time because they had been cut off from Russian natural gas because of the unprovoked invasion in Ukraine and the war that was underway there. And they were scrambling for what they were going to do to keep their residents warm this past winter. Fortunately, it was a relatively mild winter across much of Europe, but they were taking, really, really unique steps in Poland in particular, one of the largest polluters in Europe, reliant almost entirely on coal-fired plants. And ironically, 20% comes from Ukrainian nuclear plants in Poland. But they were changing laws to allow residents to burn the dirtiest forms of coal lignite in their chimneys at home to get through the winter, which was going to be a real concern from an environmental standpoint and a health perspective. But right now the polls are all in on going with the technology that we're building at Darlington, and so I think the fact that we've really nailed the can-do refurbishments and we're leading the way and in that front seat on deployment of small modular reactors has elevated Canada to the top of the list as a real leader when it comes to nuclear development and the answer to a lot of the energy security and energy autonomy needs that jurisdictions, particularly in Europe, are facing, but other parts of the world as well. It was quite fascinating just to be there and sense the impact of how this war in Ukraine is impacting the lives of residents in neighboring countries like Estonia and Poland and the Czech Republic and Romania and many, many others. I've had the opportunity to speak with so many of them, and many of them are now going back to nuclear because they realize that is the way they can get the energy security, energy autonomy, and meet climate goals as well.
Right. Okay, a minute on renewables, sir, if we could. There's the plan certainly talked about renewables, but there was some criticism for a lack of specificity and detail about where things were going to go with renewables. I would start by saying none of this seemed to be on the government's agenda when it came to power. The cleaning of the scrubbing of carbon from the grid and the electrification of the province. And in fact, the government canceled a very large number of renewable projects that had either been approved or were actually in train in production when it came into office. Is what's happening now a change of heart or a change of circumstance or what?
I think it's just more of a pragmatic approach. We had excess electricity when we became the government. It was those FIT contracts, the feed-in tariffs, that were driving up electricity rates. A lot of those projects were in unwilling host communities, and you'll recall how damaging that was for the previous Liberal government, having energy projects forced into communities that didn't support them or didn't want them. And to be honest, we just didn't need the projects at that time. I was the Minister of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade previous to Minister Fedeli, and I recall sitting in a meeting with, it was Chrysler then, it's now Stellantis, and also other automakers just saying this is the most uncompetitive jurisdiction to build cars. And this was back in 2018, 2019. I was the Minister of Economic Development who took the phone call from General Motors saying after 100 years of building cars in Oshawa, they were going to be closing that plant. The Premier and I were both on that call. They did say, we know it's not because of anything you guys have done. You just took office and we hope you're going to fix it and we'll be back. And I'm glad to say that we are back. But it was because in large part of those feed-in tariffs, the excess electricity that was coming onto the grid that was creating huge problems with global adjustment. Minister Rickford canceled those projects, and I think it was the right decision. I know it was the right decision to make at the time. The thing that was really missing at that time too was storage. They were creating massive fluctuations on the grid. Now that we've got the procurements out there to bring storage, both short-term duration and long-term storage onto the grid, that's actually going to create a better environment for renewables, which are now much lower cost than what was previously signed in those FIT contracts. That will make those more viable as an energy source for Ontario, energy that can be produced and then stored and then dispatched onto the grid at times that we need them when these facilities are in place. So I think just the timing, the impact that it was having on the cost of electricity, there were a number of reasons why that was the right decision to make at the time. We had to clean up the mess and get things under control. And as a result, putting out different programs like the Driving Prosperity program, which I started when I was there. Fedeli has added to that, and we're seeing the results. we've become a competitive jurisdiction again to do business, and we've got the clean grid, and we're going to build out from here just to meet the demand going forward.
What are we going to do about EV charging stations?
Build more of them.
People aren't going to buy these cars in sufficient numbers until they're absolutely satisfied that they're not going to run out of juice on the side of the road.
Yeah, no question. No question. Particularly here in the part of the country that I'm in right now, and I know this is a concern for the federal government as well. And when I was with Minister Wilkinson in Quebec City, he had just made an announcement on EV infrastructure at that time. Working with Bell and a couple of other partners in Quebec. We've started the work here in Ontario with the Ministry of Transportation, rolling out EV charging stations at en route locations right across the 400 series of highways. We've got a rural and remote communities EV package that was in the budget. So Minister Sarkaria and myself, who's now at Ministry of Transportation, will be rolling that out. So communities in those rural parts of Ontario, like mine, will have more opportunity for folks to charge. Tesla's already done a lot of the work. Tesla has rolled out EV charging stations from Nova Scotia right through to BC. So you can travel across Canada and know where the charging stations are if you own a Tesla. But we have a lot of work to do as federal and provincial governments and the private sector, really, to ensure that these charging stations are there. And we don't see the type of situations that have been happening in California and other places where people can't get a charge.
I mean, I think that's got to be the remaining roadblock, Minister, don't you? I mean, other than in pure rural areas where it may not make sense for quite a while, the cars are better. The EV cars are better. Like, people are going to want them, except for this range anxiety issue.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's why you're going to see adoption in the large cities, first. Where the commute for folks isn't as long and maybe the weather isn't as harsh as it can be in Northern Ontario in particular. But we do, projections are only projections. You don't know exactly what the uptake in EV ownership is going to be, but I suspect there will be a significant increase. And there has already been an uptake in purchases of electric vehicles. I think that is largely the big issue that has to be dealt with. And we're putting some money into that program to ensure there is the infrastructure there, but there's a lot more to do on that front. There's no question.
Yeah, it feels to me like it won't work if you build it incrementally to meet demand. It feels like you need to build it so that they will come.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. So we've been talking about electricity generation and where the electricity is going to come from. But another product is, how are we going to move it to where it needs to be? I mean, I assume just in general that the overall transmission lines grid in the province will need to be substantially upgraded. But then, Minister, I hear things like, if everybody on my street got an electric vehicle right now, there isn't enough electricity coming to my street to handle that. So it feels to me like there's an enormous job of building a grid that accommodates the electrification of all energy. How's that happening?
Yeah, there is a lot of work that has to be done. We appointed a panel, David Cawley, about a year ago now, and Cawley's team is coming back to us with recommendations on what we can do. I've provided direction to the Ontario Energy Board as well, to make sure that utilities have plans that also reflect the growing use of EVs in the communities that they provide electricity to. So that planning work is being done. It's going to be a big job, in places like Toronto, for instance, where surprisingly, given all of the growth that we've seen in Toronto over the last 10 years, I mean, there's a condo building going up every time you turn around, or 10. And but
I live in a neighborhood of cranes.
Yeah, well, most people in Toronto, I think, do, right? They are the city bird is the crane.
Exactly.
The demand for electricity in Toronto surprisingly hadn't gone up over the last 10 years because of conservation demand management programs that we've invested in and local distribution companies have invested in as well. But more specifically to your question, demand is going to grow. substantially, particularly with EV adoption. So it's important that LDCs are preparing for this. The Ontario Energy Board has been given the direction to prepare for this. And, I know in talking to leadership at Toronto Hydro, for instance, that they are preparing for this. There's going to have to be a new transmission line into Toronto to get the power into the GTA. And, we've committed to building out massive new transmission down through southwestern Ontario to accommodate some of the projects that we discussed earlier on the program, like the EV plants, the EV battery plants, and the phasing out of those giant mounds of coal on the Hamilton Harbor for the electric arc furnaces. And those projects are going ahead. The lines have been designated. Hydro One is starting to build them now. And the same type of infrastructure, quite honestly, is going to have to be built right across the province. And a lot of that is laid out in the Powering Ontario's growth plan. There's going to be some necessary transmission line changes, particularly a north-south line to accommodate the movement of electrons from Northern Ontario down into the GTA where the load is, where the energy is required. Same story out through Eastern Ontario. We announced a new swapping of power with Quebec last week in Quebec City as well. There has to be some new transmission and some improvements to the line there to accommodate even more trade with Quebec. So the work is being done. It's been outlined, but there's still a lot of work to do for sure. There's no question about it.
All right. So my last question, I gotta let you go. I'd have more, but you're a busy man. So you're a practical person. I can tell this. But I'm sitting here and I'm thinking to myself, okay, already we're told that we don't have enough skilled workers to build shit in this country. And between approval processes, environmental assessments, everything takes 100 years to get built. I'm mesmerized by the sheer amount of work that is involved in what's going to happen. We have to build in Ontario millions of homes. We have to rebuild a lot of public infrastructure. Jonathan Wilkinson told me we have to retrofit most of our buildings. And now we have to construct all of these major energy projects. Can we do this?
Yes. And I think we're on our way to doing that. My biggest concern right now, particularly around big nuclear projects, David, is like the Bruce one, for instance. And I've shared this with Minister Wilkinson a number of different times, is just the length of time or the impact that the Federal Impact Assessment Act may have on a new project. This is new legislation, as you know, that we're worried may bog down progress on these projects. In the case of Bruce, this is probably the most studied piece of land in Canada, I would suspect. It's been a nuclear power site for a number of years now. And we have the best regulator, I believe, when it comes to nuclear at the CNSC. We have world-class environmental assessments here in Ontario. I think the largest barrier to us hitting that 100% clean electricity grid could potentially be the Federal Impact Assessment Act, particularly around nuclear, but other projects as well. I think that we all want to get it done and make sure that we're building the infrastructure that we need, be it subways in Toronto, hospitals, long-term care homes, highways that we're going to need, and schools and power projects. We have to ensure that we have processes in place that are world-class and that are going to protect our environment, ensure that we're consulting with Indigenous communities and municipalities as well. I believe we already have that in Ontario, and it doesn't need to be duplicated. And I believe that the federal government is open to working with us on ensuring that we're able to get projects like 4,800 new megawatts of nuclear started at Bruce Power in time to help the federal government meet the targets that they want to meet. So I feel like there is that collaboration, a willingness to work together and use the rules that are in place and use the processes that are in place to help us all achieve the goals that we set out.
Cool. All right. In just one quick minute, since you're a hockey coach, I just love hearing people explain to me how the Leafs are going to win the Stanley Cup this year. So what's your theory on how the Leafs win the Stanley Cup this year? Well,
I am a Leafs fan, and I played hockey for a long time, and was a hockey coach for many years, mostly girls hockey. My daughters both played rep hockey in Belleville with the Bearcats. And for the Leafs, they need to play more like Bearcats. And I think they brought in some players that are going to help them play a little bit more playoff style hockey. You know, guys like Bertuzzi and Domi and Reeves, and I think hopefully they.
Although neither the Bertuzzi or Domi that you have are quite the Bertuzzis and Domis people think of when they hear those names, but
well, that may be true. That may be true, but we'll see, right? I'm optimistic.
Optimistic. Minister, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for all the work you're doing for Ontario. Thank you for going into public life. It's great when people like yourself uproot themselves and decide to do that. And thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for coming on the show to talk to us about it today. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and everybody who watched or listened. We'll be back next week with more Herle Burly. And thank you, Minister Smith.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it.